So tonight we're going to be in Joshua chapter 1, or at least we're going to start in Joshua chapter 1. I'll limit the recap a little bit. That seems to take up quite a bit of our time. If you missed last week, or if you weren't here, or you were one saying, I didn't see it online, we didn't go on without you. We did something else last week because of a scheduling conflict that I had, and we're going to pick up where we left off 2 weeks ago, I think it was. And I told you the end of the story was Moses died. The end. That's where we left off. All right, so we've gone through 40 years basically of wandering in the wilderness in just a couple weeks. There are more stories that I didn't cover in either the book or in this series of lessons. But there's other stories you can look at. And as a matter of fact, as I was looking at Joshua again this week in preparation for this, I saw things in there that I thought, why didn't I write about that? Why didn't I include that story? There's other stuff that if I ever do another edition, I'll probably spend more time on the book of Joshua. But we're going to hit the highlights at least. And tonight, depending on how fast I talk and how fast you listen, that's all right. We might finish the book of Joshua tonight. But I'm not determined to do that. So if there's stuff you want to discuss, we can stop and do that too. I'm not determined to cover a certain amount of ground. All right, but we're going to start in Joshua chapter 1. And once Moses had passed away, he had appointed a successor. Really, God had been the one who had appointed the successor, and Moses had just publicly named Joshua as the successor. But God is really the one who appointed him. Now, what do we already know about Joshua from the stories that we've looked at? What's his claim to fame? He fought the Battle of Jericho, but in what we've already discussed, what was his claim to fame?
He was one of the 12 spies.
He was one of the 12 spies. Was he a good spy or a bad spy? Good spy. Otherwise, he'd be dead by now, right? God said he was one of the two people in Israel over the age of 20 who were going to get to enter into the promised land. The other extra credit if you can name the other one. Caleb, all right. I don't know how much extra credit because I'm not grading this, but there's your gold star, right? Oh, okay. Gold stars for everybody who said it. All right.
The thing I remember about Caleb, he said, I'm 80, give me that mountain you promised me.
There you go.
Amen. That mountain.
So Joshua was one of the two spies who had come back and given the good report. If you recall, the bad report was, we can't possibly take the land. The good report was, God already gave us the land. He just told us to check it out, and it's everything he promised. But the people didn't go for that, and so they were condemned to spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Now, by the time we pick up here in Joshua chapter 1, Moses has passed away, and God has revealed to Joshua that it's time to prepare the people to go ahead and cross the Jordan River and take possession of the promised land. And God told Joshua, he said, I'm going to be with Israel so that there's nobody that's going to be able to stand against me, because there was no... even in the promised land, even though it had been promised to them, there were already people living there. There's no open land in history. I heard somebody make this point on the radio the other day, talking about our country and how there's the big debate over the land being stolen from the Native Americans and this and that. And I have mixed feelings about it because I had ancestors on both sides of that. But the point was made, there's no spot on earth that some other group hasn't owned before the group that owns it now. And there were people already, the promised land wasn't just virgin wilderness, all right? There were already people that lived there called the Canaanites. And it was good land, and they kind of liked living there. They didn't want to give it up. And yet God had said, I'm going to go with you, I'm going to be with you, so that the Canaanites aren't going to be able to stand against them. Let's look at verses 1 through 3 here of Joshua chapter 1. It says, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, that's hard to say, saying, Moses my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all the people, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel, every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you, as I said to Moses. So he said, go, I'm going to lead you in, and you go in, and it's yours, and everywhere the sole of your foot touches is going to be yours. It's quite a promise there, isn't it? They're not going to be walking in foreign country. Any place they set their foot as they go into the promised land is by definition theirs. Now that doesn't mean that God is only going to give them the places that they put their feet. I mean, they're not having to shuffle into the country so they make sure they don't miss an inch. It's God's way of saying, it's all yours. Just go in and take it. So the people finally were firmly behind Joshua in this idea of going into the promised land. Now, had the previous generation been that way? No. When Joshua and Caleb tried to rally their parents and grandparents and say, come on guys, we can go take it, how did they respond? They said, we're too weak. Huh?
Oh, woe is me.
Oh, woe is me. So there was a lot of griping and complaining and saying, no, we can't. But if memory serves, they kind of turned on Joshua and Caleb, didn't they? They were ready to do what? Stone them to death if my memory's correct. But now, finally, they were in line behind Joshua, and they prepared themselves. They did what he said to do. And Joshua, here we go again. Joshua sent 2 spies to scout out the area around Jericho. I think it's funny he sent out 2. He didn't send out 12. It was only 2 that could manage to do the right thing before. So he sends 2 again. Go and spy out the area around Jericho. Chapter 2, verse 1 says, go view the land, especially Jericho. Unfortunately, what were there in Jericho? What was living in Jericho? People. There were people in Jericho, and those people caught them or detected them and did not like that they were there. And so the king of Jericho sent his troops to search for the Israelite spies. He said, these Israelites are here, and we need to go find them, because they had heard the Israelites were coming. They were not comfortable with the Israelites being so close by, because they were worried about what was going to happen. And so while the 2 Israelite spies are darting in and out of the alleyways and streets of Jericho, and they're hiding, and I sort of imagine the opening scenes of Aladdin where he's running through the streets of the town and hiding, they finally take shelter as they've got these soldiers chasing after them. They finally take shelter in the home of a woman named Rahab, who was a prostitute. And when the soldiers came looking for them, they're going door to door. They think they've seen them dart into Rahab's house, so they come and pound on the door. And Rahab says, they already left. Now, she's turned against her own people to do this. But she protects these spies from God because she believes that God is going to give them the land. It's incredible that this Canaanite prostitute has more faith than a lot of the Israelites have had. There's a lesson in there for us, I'm sure. Look at chapter 2, verses 4 through 7. They worked out a deal before she hides them. Then the woman took the 2 men and hid them. Or they work out a deal because she hides them. The woman took the 2 men and hid them. She said, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And it happened as the gate was being shut, when it was dark, that the men went out. Where the men went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you may overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and had hidden them with the stalks of flax, which she had laid in order on the roof. Then the men pursued them by the road to the Jordan, to the fords. And as soon as those who pursued them had gone out, they shut the gate. So Rahab tells them, they already left, but I bet if you leave like right now, you can probably still catch them. Meanwhile, she's hidden them up on the roof under bundles of plants. And so these soldiers take off out of the city. The city shuts the gates behind them, and they take off toward the fords, which are where they would try to cross the Jordan at a shallow place. They're chasing them all the way back to the Israelite camp, back to the borders of their country. the kids and I have had some discussions about this story because it's brought up, it has been brought up when we talk about not lying. But God blessed Rahab. Okay, fine. You know what? If God tells you to lie to us because you're protecting Israelite spies from us, maybe we'll talk. We could have a long and involved discussion. Are there times that God is okay with lying? I'm not prepared to have that discussion tonight because it seems like there are, but I'm not sure where the line is around that. Okay, typically God is against lying, but apparently he made an exception in the case of Rahab. So she said...
It doesn't really say that God asked her to.
No, he
lie
didn't.
On their behalf.
You're right. He didn't ask her to lie. But he... lie, maybe a better way to say that. So.
Well, he blessed a lot of people in the Bible who did things that were not
right.
God's will.
Yeah. If you didn't hear that, he blessed a lot of people in the Bible who were not doing who were not doing right things. He blessed them anyway. And maybe that's a better way to explain this, that he blessed her in spite of her lie because of her faith. Maybe that's it. Because God, as we're going to talk about Sunday morning, God himself is not capable of lying. So I don't think he's in favor of lying ever. But that was just a hard question to answer for the kids. Yeah, were you saying something?
Tactics in battle involve deceit.
True.
And that's lying.
Yeah.
Divert the enemy or whatever.
Yeah.
They were involved in this.
Yeah. Mercy also.
Mercy, yeah.
God's mercy is renewed every day.
Yeah. It's not as though she did a good thing by lying, but God was merciful in spite of that. Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
I've noticed also in the genealogy of Jesus that it goes along that same line where even though people were of disreputable backgrounds, God chose to still use them in a magnificent way.
That's true.
Because Rahab was a ancestor.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, she was one of the ancestors of Jesus. God used some terrible people in that genealogy to bring his son into the world. David.
You smelly fishermen in the New Testament.
Yeah, you smelly fishermen. You know what? I need to go back and explain that to the kids. Then maybe it was just grace in spite of her actions. But I brought that up in case somebody else did tonight to say I don't know. I don't have a solid answer on that. I just know God's standard of holiness. I know what this story is, and I have not yet fit them together. But
well, commentary in my Bible says, in the Scripture, it says they went and came to the house of a harlot named Rahab. That was a good cover for them trying to hide out as they were trying to seek things out, but they were found out anyway. And then it goes on and says, in spite of this precaution, their presence became known. God in his sovereign providence wanted them there for the salvation of the harlot.
mm-hmm.
She would provide an example of his saving by faith a woman at the bottom of the social strata, as he saved Abraham at the top. Most importantly, by God's grace, she was in the Messianic line.
Yeah.
So it was God showing his grace to this woman all along the way.
Yeah. He showed incredible grace to somebody who didn't deserve it but had faith.
Well, he does that to us all the time.
Exactly. And so I'm glad I brought this up because that's a good answer to give the kids. No, you can't get off on the lie, on the technicality that God blessed Rahab, because that's a totally different. That's about grace and not about God being okay with lying.
You know, one time God sent lying spirits to talk to one of the enemies. I can't remember now which king it was. God sent lying spirits to convince them.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember which story that is now, but I know what you're talking about, and I spent some time digging into that too. So she told the soldiers that the Israelites planned to sneak out and that they might still be able to catch them, and so they pursued them all the way to the Jordan River. The whole time they were They were still up there on Rahab's roof. And so she told the spies, because I'm sure they were curious why this Canaanite woman would hide them. And she explained to them that the Israelites' presence just on the other side of the river, because Jericho is pretty near the Jordan River. Word had gotten out that the Israelites were encamped just on the other side of the river, and she said it was causing panic among the Canaanites. And if we look at verses 9 through 13 here, she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land. I mean, think about that. There is no question in her mind that the God of Israel has taken this land and granted it to them. It's already a done deal. There's no question of that in her mind. If the Israelites 40 years ago had that kind of faith, how might history have been different? That the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you, for the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Now therefore I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you will also show kindness to my father's house, and give me a true token, and spare my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and all they have, and deliver our lives from death. Do you realize what she has just said there? The reason why now think about this, that the Israelites have been afraid of the Canaanites because they're so big. The Canaanites are afraid of the Israelites because their God is so big. The Canaanites have heard the stories about what God did in Egypt. The Canaanites have heard the stories of what God has done at the Red Sea. The Canaanites have heard the stories about how God has taken care of the Israelites during this wilderness wandering. For some of these things happened 40 years earlier, and they are still talking about them, and they are still terrified of the Israelites because of their God. The Israelites, though, as we've seen in those stories, the Israelites would go a few days and start complaining at God like God couldn't deliver them, because I know you just delivered us from that massive thing like 9 days ago, but what have you done for us lately? Does it seem sometimes like the pagan world might take these things more seriously than God's people do?
All the time.
At times, yeah. I mean, what were you saying?
All the time. You're seeing that same thing where those out there that have heard the stories but not necessarily been involved with what was happening, that they're the one that has the fear. And the respect, I think, is a good word for what God has done, whereas His own people have not that same respect.
Yeah, I think that's right. We've got to be very careful about that. That as God's people, we don't let our familiarity with God get in the way of our awe of God and what He's done. That we should rely on God's provision and God's protection, but we shouldn't grow so used to it that we forget to be amazed by it. And that's what they had done. And God had just taken care of them all along the way, so they weren't really... any little thing went wrong and it was the end of the world. Instead of running to God, they complained about God.
You suppose that after 40 years of listening to those stories and stuff, and it got really in their mind, that's one reason they were so afraid. Listen to all that.
Possibly, yeah, for 40 years.
On the other hand, you wonder if their God survived. How come they stayed over there so many years?
Right. I don't know. That's a good point. I wonder if this generation of Canaanites grew up hearing the stories, the bedtime stories and the campfire stories about the Israelites under the bed, them and their scary God, and they might jump out and get you at any time, and suddenly, because God's done all these things to these other nations, and suddenly now they're on your doorstep.
And there's that parallel between when the spies went in, 10 of them, oh no, we can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
And then she is refuting everything that they have said, basically. Because she's saying, look how, we're so afraid of you.
Mm-hmm.
We've heard the stories. We know what's happening.
Yeah.
And it's just contrary to what those 10 spies believe.
Right. And it's just further confirmation that they should have listened to God all along. Not that they needed to hear it from Rahab for it to be true, but it's a lesson for them. And so Rahab knew that they were eventually going to take over the area because God had said it, and God had this track record of doing what he said he was going to do. And so Rahab asked the Israelites to spare her whole family. And they said they would protect her and her family the way she had protected them if she would place a scarlet cord in her window when they came. There's this really interesting conversation that they have with her at the end of this story. You ought to go back and look at it. But they basically tell her, if that cord is not there, we are not responsible for what happened. They're adding all the disclaimers there. If that cord's not in the window, we're not responsible. If anybody in your family leaves this house where the cord in the window is, we're not responsible. We will protect you under these conditions, but we are not responsible. I mean, they are laying out all the fine print. And she agrees. And so they, with her assistance, they rappelled down the walls of the city, and they made their way back to the Israelite camp, and they reported to Joshua everything that had happened there, and presumably told him about the deal that they made with Rahab. Do you have something to say?
Yeah, it's interesting to me to see the different symbology or visual pictures that you see in the gospel or even in the Old Testament in these cases where things are, where people have to make their side of where they're standing. Mm-hmm. And anybody that goes beyond that, I mean, you think about Noah and the ark. If anybody left the ark after the door was closed or before it was closed, they would be caught there. But you see also played out in this instance as well. And of course, I've seen that in other instances as well. Like if you have people looking at the brazen serpent there, it's just very interesting to see all those little visual aid pictures of the salvation.
That's good. Yeah, I hadn't really made that connection, but that's good. They were under the protection of the Scarlet, and there was only one way of salvation when those walls came in. That'll preach. That's good. That's good. And I look for these things. I deliberately try to find these things, and I missed that one. That's good. All right. Any questions or comments on that story? All right. So now they're going to move into the Promised Land when we get to chapters 3 and 4. They camped along the riverbank. They're ready to go in, and Joshua told them that they were going to go into the land the next day. And in verses 3 through 5, he says, when you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests and the Levites bearing it, then you shall set out from your place and go after it. Yet there shall be a space between you and it, about 2,000 cubits by measure. Do not come near it, that you may know the way by which you must go, for you have not passed this way before. And Joshua said to the people, sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And there's a little more to it than that. But basically they said, go follow the Ark of the Covenant, which was a visible representation of God's presence among them. Follow that. Stay close behind that, but not too close. Now, he gives a reason why they're not supposed to get too close. And what does he specifically say? It's holy. That's true. I think that's part of it. But he says, because you have not been this way before. He doesn't want them to get out ahead of the ark. We have a tendency to do that when we're walking as a group. I know all that time, all those hours and hours we spent on trails, I would try to keep the boys, with Dad last month, I'd try to keep the boys where I wanted them, in between. Either Dad or I was in the front, and whichever one was not in the front would be in the back. And the boys would be in the rocking chair, we'd call it if we were truckers. They'd be in between us. That way somebody's keeping an eye on them. They're not going off the trail. Benjamin, though, whoever was in front, he'd want to get out in front of them. You don't know where we're going, and all these trails look alike, okay? We have a tendency to do that, and they were probably going to run ahead of the ark. He said, you've got to stay back. But also, I think, too, there's a lesson in there that the ark is holy. You know, you're not just hanging out with the ark. It's leading you as God's presence. And so they were supposed to go and follow the ark. Yes, sir.
I just saw this when reading this. It's really interesting because there was other ways across that particular body of water. Because we know that when Rahab told the fellow Jericho people, you know, and they checked out those areas where the water was maybe easier to cross, you know that God did not tell the children of Israel, okay, we're going to go by the areas over here because the water level is low. To me, that's significant because it tries to say, okay, I'm having you develop your trust in me. That I'm going to provide, I'm going to go before you. Yeah. I've got this covered, even because we know that at least in some of those water areas, that water is very uncontrollable. Yeah. It was very, not as easy to cross. And of course, in this, it shows not by your works, people, is by my work that I am doing this. Yeah. And I know that even sometimes in my life, at least, sometimes he puts me at a point where I look at the big surrounding picture and say, I cannot do this. And God says, that's right, you can't, but I can. That's right. And so it's beautiful that he said, I'll go there before you and I'll show you that I'll let you get to the other side without no loss.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, we know from the previous story where it says the soldiers pursued them to the fords of the Jordan. We know there's at least one spot where it's easy to cross. That's a good point. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the computer game Oregon Trail that we used to, at least at my age, you used to play it in school back when Macintosh computers were huge. And you would ford the Missouri River or whatever, and it was a shallow spot where you could drive your oxen across the river and hopefully not get dysentery along the way. That's a joke, but most of you apparently haven't played it. But that's supposed to be the easy way to cross the river was at the ford. He doesn't take them to the ford, as Brent pointed out. He doesn't take them to the ford. He takes them someplace they're going to have to trust him. They're going to have to get to the body of water and go, okay, what now? How do we get across this? And he's going to provide a way. And it is an exercise, as he said, in trusting God. Wait a minute, why are we not going this way? Just watch what God's going to do.
Nice repeat of history, too, because they probably heard the story about Red Sea.
Yeah.
What something that strikes my mind is probably go in Jimmy Ann's book, but nevertheless, what about the cloud? Was the cloud going with them over the ark as they moved along? And what did this cloud look like? Because that in itself would be something probably fearful for people to see. It just that cloud over the ark.
I'm sure it would be a fearful thing. I don't remember if the cloud is still with them at this point.
The cloud just went with them to the border until they got to the promised land. That's
what I was thinking. I was thinking at this point they're just being led by the ark. But the next morning they picked up the ark, the priests did, and they went toward the river like they were told. And the people see the ark taken off and they think, by golly, we better follow that train. It's leaving. And so when the priests reached the bank of the river where God told them to go, they stepped out onto the bank and the water stopped flowing. And I've tried to picture this. It's not like the whole river just froze. And it's not like you've got I know there are currents and things in the Red Sea, but it's not even like that. You've got a flowing body of water here. So what happens, it's like the water just stops in one spot, like somebody built an invisible dam is the way I picture it. An invisible dam in this spot in the water. So that water down there keeps flowing away. You've got this dry spot, and behind it, this invisible dam is holding back the water that continues to cascade down, and it talks about how the river tumbles over its banks and floods the areas behind it on the Jordan. It's a really incredible thing that is described here. It stopped flowing. It flooded upstream for miles. And the priests stood in the middle of the river, in the middle of the riverbed, while the people crossed on dry ground. And Joshua had told them, as God told him, that he had picked one man from each of the 12 tribes, each to grab a big stone and take with them across the river. And on the other side, they were going to assemble these 12 stones into a memorial, so they would always remember how God held back the river so that they could cross. And it says in chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, that this may be a sign among you when your children ask in time to come, saying, "What do these stones mean to you?" Then you shall answer them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be a memorial to the children of Israel forever. So I would assume they're still there somewhere. Maybe somebody just hadn't stumbled onto them and realized what they are. But God also knew that people are visual, children are curious. Here's a way to remind the people of Israel. I'm sure you've all had kids or grandkids who have said, "What's that?" Seen stuff at the house, or even just driving around. "What is that?" Probably to the point that you get tired of explaining things, right? They were going to see this pile of 12 stones and say, "What is that?" Just like our kids would. What is that? And that was going to afford the people of Israel the opportunity and the responsibility to teach the next generation what God had done.
You know, the question comes to me when it talks about stopping the flow.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we just think of a few people, but we're talking a couple of million.
Mm-hmm.
How long and how wide was that path? And how long did it take for 2 million people? That water had to be stopped for a long time.
Probably.
And we're talking about taking your cattle and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
You just think about getting everybody to the city of Lawton, which would be a small portion there.
Yeah.
It'd take a long time.
It would take a long
If
time.
that water was flowing very fast, it would really flood.
Yeah. Yeah. We're not talking about a little thing here.
No, but you know, when you first read that story, you just think about a few people going across.
Right.
That's what comes to mind.
Right.
Then when you get down to the facts of how many it was.
I think we're talking at least hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah.
At least. I've heard estimates as high as 2 million Israelites walking in the wilderness. You've heard 3. I don't know where they come up with those numbers unless it's from the book of Numbers. I'd have to go back and look at that. But so if my estimate is too low, if the Bible says something else, I'm wrong and the Bible's right, obviously. But just I picture at least hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah, but if you just think about the Ark of the Covenant going through there,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you kind of think about a big creek that come through there instead of a wide.
Right. Yeah.
Doesn't make any difference. It happened. That's
Right.
all that matters.
But it's a reminder to us that, I mean, this miracle is not really it's not like we would look at this after the Red Sea and go, "Oh, well, that's anticlimactic. That's kind of a letdown." This was pretty incredible too. It's not just parting a little string. When we were up in the Panhandle, we kept seeing the Beaver River, which is what they call the North Canadian River up there. And you know, at places down around Oklahoma City or some areas where we've fished out in Okfuskee County, it can be a fairly good-sized stream. Up there, I'm looking, going, I see the riverbed. Where's the river? I mean, there's maybe a little trickle of water through there. God was not parting something like that. God was holding back a major flow of water. So I don't think this is any less incredible than the Red Sea, and then having to have time for all those people to cross.
Well, actually, you talk about the Red Sea. That's a sea. That's not moving.
Right.
Body of water. So
Right.
Actually, this is even.
And those priests standing there holding the ark
Yeah.
for that period of time for all these people to
Yeah.
cross.
Yeah.
If I had a choice where God said, you know, I can show you what it looked like. We can go back in time. If I had a choice and God said, you can see one of these two, but only one of these two, I want to see this one more than the Red Sea, because this one sounds pretty incredible. Yes, sir.
Commentary in my Bible says excuse me, that verse what verse is this? 16. Chapter 3, verse 16. So the waters that went down, before that, during the whole time of harvest, that the waters which came down from upstream stood still and rose in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zartan. And the commentary says Adam was 15 miles north of where they crossed. So if they were able to see the water piled up as they were crossing the dry land, and it was 15 miles away, it was a pretty high heat.
Yeah.
You know, this deal about this phenomenon, these floods caused by the river. A while ago we were talking about how the unfriendlies had a fear of the Israelites. That kind of stuff was better than any newspaper.
Oh, right.
Putting fear of this nation's God into these outliers.
Yes.
I've never thought about that.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure word got around quickly. People see a big pile of water upstream.
Causing these floods when they go back and forth.
Yeah. I'll come right back to you. Yes, ma'am.
I've always been perplexed by a little thing that I didn't even see for a long time, that it was the rod that held the water back when they left Egypt.
Yes.
But here it's the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
Is there some significance? There has to be some significance in that.
Just off the top of my head, my guess would be that they were both symbols of the Lord's authority at that time, because the rod was given to Moses and to as a symbol of his leadership. And once they built and Moses kind of was the visible reminder of God's presence. Well, then they built the Ark of the Covenant, and that's what they looked to as the reminder. That would be, I mean, we can study it out and see if there's a reason, but that's the first thing that comes to my mind is...
I didn't even notice that little sentence for years.
Yeah. That would be my, off the top of my head, guess as to why God used the rod and then the ark. That and the ark didn't exist at the time of the parting of the Red Sea. Okay, yes, sir.
I'm sorry, you guys have to bear with me
You're
here.
good.
But as a parent and teaching my children that God is not just the God of the grand stuff, the big stuff that everybody sees sometimes, but He's also the God that even deals with the minute, small details. And to me, that the significance that they were on dry ground. I mean, I know my kids when they were young, anytime that there was a mud puddle around, they would want to play in it. So, and we spend lots of minutes there. So I'm thankful that God is a God of detail. So I could just see, okay, we're going to dry this out completely. No mud puddles to distract my kids.
Yes.
You know, and I'm going to worry about the tires getting stuck. It's just going to be completely dry. So I'm grateful for the lesson that to me that yes, He does the big thing of keeping the wall of water over there. But He also takes care of the mud puddles so that my kids don't get distracted. I don't get distracted.
That's a good point, because there'd be a lot of Israelites with 4-year-olds still trying to get across that river today.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, sir.
The final commentary in chapter 3 in my Bible says, the Exodus began with the crossing on dry ground at the Red River, and the Exodus ended with crossing over the Jordan on dry land.
Yes.
And then once they were across the Jordan, they were no longer in an Exodus, they were to occupy that land.
Yes. Yes. These are kind of the bookends of
A new
the
phase
Exodus.
of life for the Israelites.
Yes. All right. Any other questions or comments? If not, we'll move on to the Battle of Jericho. Oh, yes, ma'am.
You raised your hand, did you?
No, I'm good.
You're good?
Okay.
Okay.
I'm good.
I'm sorry I didn't see you.
That's quite all right.
All right, we'll move on to the Battle of Jericho, and we might get through this tonight. We might not. We'll see. We can get through the story. I don't know if we'll get through with the discussion. We can always pick it up there next week if we need to. So, Joshua chapter 6 is where the story is where the actual destruction of Jericho starts, but the story starts back in chapter 5. Actually, we may not even get into the destruction of Jericho depending on this. Chapter 5, starting in verse 13, it says, "And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him, with his sword drawn in his hand. Stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, Are you for us or for our adversaries? So he said, No. But as a commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped, and said to him, What does my Lord say to his servant? Then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy. And Joshua did so." I cannot believe I didn't spend more time talking about this when I put the chronology together. Joshua encounters this man out near Jericho and says to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And his answer is no. Not the answer he's looking for. I do that to my kids all the time. Benjamin says, was Andrew Jackson a good man or a bad man? Yes. You say that about most figures in history. Yes. He's really not looking for a yes or no answer. Are you for us or our adversaries? No. I'm for the Lord. Now, ultimately, he's going to be on Joshua's side, but only because Joshua is going to be on the Lord's side. But he says, I am the commander of the Lord's army. Some translations say the captain of the Lord's host. Now, he also says here, it says here that Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped.
Jesus.
That's where I'm going with this. And he calls him my Lord. Now, the word Lord there is not the Hebrew word with 4 letters, Yahweh, which is the proper name of God. It's the word Adonai. But that word is, so it's a title, not a name. But it's typically applied to God himself in the Old Testament. And Joshua falls down and worships him. If this were a mere angel, he would say, no, don't do that. It leads me to the conclusion that this is Jesus Christ showing up before Bethlehem. I mean, that's not a unanimous view of every Bible scholar that looks at this, but that's the conclusion I come to.
That's what's in my commentary.
Yeah. I'd say it's the majority view among evangelical scholars.
Well, for it to be holy, he says that, take off your sandal because this ground is holy.
Where have we heard
God
that before?
can only make that ground holy.
Right.
So the personification of God is Jesus.
Exactly.
And same thing with when Moses was at the burning bush.
Exactly. Jeff, I think you answered the question, but you got to do it right. Moses. We heard that with Moses at the burning bush when he spoke to God. He said, take off your sandals, you're on holy ground. He's not in the presence of an angel. I mean, he's not in the presence of a created being. He's in the presence of God himself. Now, as I've told you before, sometimes in the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord can be the Lord himself. That word angel just means messenger. So if Jesus comes bearing a message from God, he's the angel of the Lord. That doesn't mean that he's less than God, because again, it just means messenger. That's incredible to me that Jesus shows up And now I'm sure that Joshua did not automatically think, I'm talking to the second person of the Trinity. God hadn't revealed that much at this point. We can see it looking back. All Joshua knew was that he was in the presence of God. And so he fell down and worshipped him.
Is this the first time in the Old Testament where Jesus shows up? Or is there something?
Some people say that Melchizedek, who met with Abraham, was actually Jesus. I don't know. I've studied that back and forth, and I don't know. I lean toward no on that being Jesus, but there are people out there who say it was.
Well, the creation thing, they're all three there.
Right. I think she's talking about him showing up in physical form where somebody can see him. Because I've told you, he's there from the beginning. He's mentioned in chapter 1, let us make man in our own image. John chapter 1 tells us that he was with God at creation.
Well, there's a question mark about, did he appear to Abraham?
Right.
Who was that messenger that came to
Yes.
Abraham? Could that have been Jesus?
And I suspect it was.
Maybe to Jacob?
Possibly to Jacob wrestling with the angel of the Lord. But so I don't think this is the first, but to my mind they seem to get clearer as time goes on until you get to Bethlehem and it's just unmistakable unless you just don't want to see it, like the Pharisees didn't. Because I'm trying to think chronologically here, because the Old Testament is not completely in chronological order. But I'm thinking the last major one of they call them Christophanies, appearances of Christ before the incarnation. And if I remember correctly, the last major Christophany is with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And it says right there, the fourth one is like the Son of God. I mean, they start picking up on this, apparently. I've talked to you about that in the auditorium, about, well, did Nebuchadnezzar say that, or did he say a son of the gods? And Nebuchadnezzar went with what he knew and recognized that this was a divine person. He knew it was more than just a regular person. I'm probably answering more than what you asked. I'll just go back to this is something I'm still studying and learning about myself. But I guess just to answer your question, I don't think it's the first, but they are getting clearer, and this one's pretty unmistakable as far as I'm concerned. There's some debate back and forth over those ones in Genesis, but this one's pretty clear to me that it's got to be Jesus. Does that answer? Or were you wondering about a specific instance before this? I do that sometimes. I answer the question and then I continue answering questions that weren't asked, and I need to just stop. Yes, sir.
I do apologize. I keep on saying things, but I'm a little bit excited on some things that I'm observing when we're going through this. Many times I get the excuse from people that truly do not know the nature of God, that say that God is a warmonger of the Old Testament. How can he be as different in the New Testament? And of course, when we read this account about Joshua and his encounter with this holy being, he was saying, no, I'm not a warmonger. I'm not here to cause this. I'm on the Lord's side. And so to me, that gives me at least an answer in my mind that I can tell him, no, that's not his position, and neither is mine, to go and annihilate every person out there that doesn't profess to have a relationship with God. I'm here to present the gospel, the good news. And the second thing, of course, that is obvious is that it gives me comfort is that no matter how much uncleanness I have, if he's in my heart or if he's in my life, he'll make me holy. Just like in Isaiah's case with the unclean lips. so I can take comfort that when God comes on the scene, He can make you holy.
That's right.
It's not with anything you do, of course. I don't think the shooting off was it.
Yeah.
But it's definitely God doing it.
Yeah.
And so I can take comfort in it. I'm sorry,
Absolutely.
it's just exciting.
No, you're good. We're not going to get to Jericho yet tonight. We'll pick up there next week. I want to address something you said, because we are about to get into a spot where a lot of the stories deal with warfare and conquest. And how many of you have heard that objection from somebody before, that the God of the Old Testament is just a warmonger, or he's... And others have heard that? I'm not alone? Okay. How could a holy God, how could a loving God do this or allow that to happen? I think, I think back to the last conflict that our country really was near unanimously united about, and that would be World War II. Because some of the wars we've fought since then, not everybody sees the threat of communism the way. Some people in my generation think that sounds like a good idea. So they wouldn't come down on Korea or Vietnam or some of those things the way I would. But go back to the last thing we were really united about, World War II. And I would ask somebody, were we wrong to go to war against Hitler? Were the British wrong to fight against Hitler? I mean, I know you could argue, well, they didn't do it because of the Holocaust. At some point, they realized that was going on and fought to stop it. Were we as a civilization wrong to throw everything we had into stopping the Nazi war machine? Why not?
He made it clear he wanted to conquer us, everybody.
He wanted to conquer us. But there was so much brutality and so much bloodshed, wasn't there?
No, there was
We killed so many
unrighteousness
people.
there.
Huh?
There was so much unrighteousness there.
Right. We killed so many people, but we were doing it to save life. Sometimes you've got to stop the madman. And in many cases, they were dealing with countries that were going to try to annihilate them. Like the Amalekites. We see the Amalekites pop up several times, and the descendants of the Amalekites pop up several times because Israel would not obey and completely destroy the nation. And so they would come again, and there'd be more bloodshed. There'd be more bloodshed. And it's the same thing with Noah's Ark. People say, well, how could a loving God destroy all of mankind? Look at what we were doing to each other. Look at what humanity was like. Every imagination was only evil all the time, constantly. Civilization was overrun with murderers and child molesters and wife abusers and every vile thing you could think of. And God stepped in to stop the madness. And the Canaanites were not angels. It's not like they were sitting around singing Kumbaya and waiting to share the land with Israel. There was no two-state solution here. So how could a loving God... Yes, God at times said, go to war. And I'm not a warmonger either. I'm not saying we should whoop up on everybody. I'm saying God sent them in specific instances to go to war because he was trying to prevent further violence down the road. Does that make sense at all? Hopefully I haven't stepped on anybody's toes too hard, but that's the best explanation I can think of as to how we can answer that objection that people throw up from time to time that, well, I couldn't worship a God like that. He's just a warmonger. Were we wrong to try to stop Hitler? Even at the cost, even at what it cost. Sometimes you've got to stop the madman. Any comments on that? Am I way off base here? Yes, sir.
Well, we know that God is, even in his dichotomy, I mean, even with the situation with Sodom and Gomorrah, when he was talking to Lot, he was narrowing it down, saying, how about 50, and kept on going down the road. I mean, it's just like when he sees the significance of one soul coming to Christ, the angels rejoice, and that's not just a few angels. I mean, that's the whole shebang.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if he has such a value in one person, and
Yeah.
Well, Canaan had been cursed from the days of Noah, right after the flood. Canaan was cursed. Canaan was going to, had already earned punishment along the way. And some of those things about him, God giving the Israelites the land of the Canaanites, that was kind of foretold already just by what Noah had to say about Canaan.
Right. Right. And they came and moved into the land anyway. Kind of in defiance of God, for that matter. Any other questions or comments? It got really heavy in here all of a sudden.
I was
Yes,
going
sir.
to say that sometimes God uses other people as their judgment. I mean, the Canaanites had been sinning against God forever and ever and ever.
Yes.
And he passed a judgment on them, and God could have used the Israelites to do it for his judgment.
That's a good point. God does sometimes use people as judgment on another group of people. The Israelites were the judgment on Canaan at that point. Later on, the Babylonians were going to be judgment on the Israelites. And then the Greeks were going to be judgment on the Babylonians, or Persians on the Babylonians, and it was just a vicious cycle.
He told Abraham that his descendants were going to be in Egypt for 400 years because the iniquity of the Amorites wasn't complete yet.
Yeah.
So he was waiting, God's got some limits.
Yes.
And we use that choice.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, sir.
I just like to say in a very silly way, God always has reset buttons.
He does. All right. Anybody else?
Just
Yes, sir.
lots and lots and lots of lessons that we shouldn't be taking to heart today.
Yeah. It's true. Yes, sir.
So I know we've passed this section, but you ever wondered if there's any significance in the chapter 2 when about the Scarlet Court?
I wondered about that, yeah.
The Scarlet Court at the opening of her house with the family gathered inside is clearly symbolic of the Passover and its placement of blood on the door frames of the house in which the family was preserved from death. At the same time that Israel celebrated the Passover in the new land, Rahab would be joining them in similar actions that would bring about her salvation from Jericho's destruction.
That sounds right to me.
They also
Parallel Passover.
They also thought it was ironic, or I don't know if it's a parallelism or not, but in Matthew's account of Jesus' crucifixion, when he was mocked and scorned, Matthew's account says they put on a scarlet robe. But if you look at Mark, it says purple. But like you got blood of the doorpost, the scarlet robe, which symbolizing the significant Passover, and then when Christ was being crucified for his crucifixion, how he was put on a scarlet robe. He died on the cross for our sins, for our salvation, same as the blood on the doorpost and the scarlet rope or cord for her due.
That's good. That's good.
I don't know where I've heard it, but I've heard about a thing called the Scarlet Thread of Scripture.
Yeah.
And how, of course, the Bible itself, in a nutshell, is the book of redemption.
Right.
So.
Well, and when I put this whole study together to write that book, that was, I don't remember if I used the phrase scarlet thread or not, but that was sort of the premise behind it, that there's there's one theme of redemption running through all these stories that kind of holds everything together. It's not just a loose collection of kind of the way it was taught to me in Sunday school as a little kid. You know, one week you'll learn about David, one week you'll learn about Daniel, and you think they're probably best friends. No, and you don't know how the stories fit together. Yeah, there's a flow to all of this, and it's all leading toward the cross.